everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another episode of the California Propertarian Podcast, abbreviated as CA Propertcast. I am your host, Philip Young, and on this show, we strongly support and defend the individual natural right to private property. We believe that is a right that proceeds from God, from a divine source that all of us are endowed with, and we believe the only just means by which men can revoke the private property rights of other men is through due process of law. So it cannot be arbitrarily, legitimately revoked by the state or by any other human entity. And that is a principle we consistently defend on this show. And on every episode, we try to discuss various issues that potentially have implications for private property rights. And to do that today, we brought on Mr. Daniel Martinez. He is an attorney and also a congressional candidate at this time. And so with that, I will kick over the introduction to Mr. Martinez. He can introduce himself and his background and his resume. And then after that, as always, we'll dive into the meat of the issue. So thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely.
And again,
pleasure.
My name is Daniel Martinez. I am the Republican candidate for the 31st Congressional District.
Excellent.
Which, if you're from Southern California, begins in Monrovia, heads to San Dimas Laverne. Then you head down the 57 to the 60 freeway, head west towards the 605, and that makes out the outer boundaries of the district. Mm-hmm. I was born in Pasadena in Huntington Memorial Hospital. My parents lived in Duarte, which is in the district. And then I went to Foothill Christian for middle school, and then graduated from Damien High School out of Laverne back in 2002.
Excellent.
After graduating, I went to the University of San Diego, where I got degrees in psychology, history, philosophy, and then I stayed for law school.
Perfect.
When I worked at law school, I was the treasurer of the Federalist Society, and I took classes with Justice Scalia in separation of powers and statutory interpretation.
That's a fantastic and prestigious resume right there. And the Federalist Society is an organization with which I have a lot of firsthand experience. When I was at Pepperdine at Seaver College, I would go to events at Seaver and also at the Caruso School of Law that were operated and chaired by the Federalist Society. So they're a terrific organization, and thank you so much for leading your campus's efforts on that front. They do a lot of fantastic work. But thank you for your candidacy as well. So just to dive in, and I know you only want to spend a little bit of time on this particular subject, but could you just tell us a little bit about what motivated you to run against, I think it's Mr. Gil Cisneros, if I'm not mistaken?
So I started running in 2022.
Okay.
Right. So we have to back up a step, right? At that time, Gil was in D.C. working as the Undersecretary of Defense in charge of implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah. Very important
Gil's
job.
not from the district. He's from Orange County. Right. And back in the California 31st District is currently held by Grace Napolitano.
Okay.
She's held the seat for over a decade. And she was elected in Barack Obama's second term, 2012, and rode his coattails into the office. And since then hasn't had a serious challenger. The individual who ran against her in 2020 and 2018 was crushed 67-33. There's a 40-point gap.
Yeah.
So by the time 2022 came around, the Republican Party wasn't going to field anybody.
Right.
And I'm an avid political watcher, so I, on a philosophical level, don't believe that it's healthy for any incumbent politician to run unopposed. And Grace was 85 at the time. I mean, she'd been fairly absent from the district, unless it was a formal politician ribbon-cutting type ceremony. But she was going to run unopposed. And I have the interest, I have the understanding of how the government works. So the only issue that I had was I wasn't a registered Republican. I was a registered libertarian at the time. Oh, wow, okay. And so I went down to the registrar's office, told them I was interested in putting my name in as a Republican candidate for November. And they said I had to switch parties. So I filled out a piece of paper and then picked up the packet and then ended up as the nominee. of the Republican Party in 2022.
All right. Well done. And thank you so much for doing that, because Gil Cisneros, he seems to me, from what I know about him, to be a classic Democratic Party hack. He seems to be a very establishment type of Democrat who's willing to toe their woke corporate line in all that he does as a candidate and while holding office. So, I'm very glad that you stepped up to the plate to do everything possible to put a stop to him.
Yeah, well, and I was doing it before Gil, right? Just to say that, right? So, because after 2022, in the 2022 race, even though Grace was winning by 40 points, I ended up closing the race under 10.
Okay.
When I closed the race under 10, all of a sudden Grace decides to retire within 6 months.
Oh, okay. All right.
So there's a direct path. There's kind of a direct evolution to my running going through there.
Right.
It was because at the time my message, I've worked with a group of veterans in post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, and suicide mitigation as a passion project going back since 2019, and I'm from the district. Azusa Pacific, there was a place called Chicken and Ribs, joint food place in front of Azusa Pacific University that I started working when I was 14 years old. When I meet people, I know where they live. I know where their kids go to school. I know where they work. So, I overperformed. I was the Republican candidate in California that overperformed more than expectations, more than any other candidate. And so then after Grace retires, then they decide to parachute Gil in from D.C.
Oh, wow, okay.
And because I gave an interview in May of 2022 regarding and the topic of Ukraine came up. And I mentioned that the Ukrainian people are being destroyed, the infrastructure is being destroyed.
Yes.
And if there's not a corrective action, course correction taken on our part, it's going to be an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah.
And that was over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And if anybody's following the front lines closest, it's an unmitigated disaster.
They've lost
dancing through a nuclear minefield.
500,000 young Ukrainian men, it's believed. So pretty much a generation of them have been, sacrificed into the maelstrom of war, of a war that didn't need to happen.
Yeah, so I try, the fog of war is great, right? And the propaganda from both sides is great. So I try not to embrace any numbers from any particular side and focus more on trend lines. And the trend lines are Russia has 3 or 4 times the population.
Yes.
Russia has a functional industrial base. Military industrial base. Russia outproduces, on artillery shells, Russia outproduces the collective West. Yeah. So fundamentally, Ukraine, assuming they got all the tools that were in the possession of the West, didn't have what was necessary for them to be able to accomplish the underlying goal. Irrespective of the morality of the participation, what we did was the worst of both worlds, was we promised something with our mouths that our military industrial base wasn't prepared to deliver on.
Yes.
And that will have consequences down the road, which interestingly enough ties back to my opponent, because my opponent was Undersecretary of Defense in charge of readiness and preparedness. That's his job.
Yes.
Instead, he became Chief Implementation Officer for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Well, because apparently that's a priority for the U.S. Department of Defense right now. Under the Biden-Harris regime, is they think pregnancy flight suits and accommodations for trannies for some reason to them that outranks and supersedes actual combat readiness.
I think it's a philosophical difference in that if you're trying to build the military functioning correctly is a series of, and not just a military, any organizational structure of human beings operating correctly has specialties. And each person performs their specialty at the maximum level possible. And they're selected for that role because they're maximally good at that specialty. And if every person within a 2 million person military organization is picked based off of that rationale and accomplishes their own individual mission, then the entire organization functions correctly. If you introduce into that rules that say whatever your primary mission used to be is now not the number one, but you have some other thing that now becomes the number one, then they will, by definition, be worse at their primary mission. And if you see 1% degradation, 10% degradation throughout the entire 2 million person organism, you'll eventually the house of cards will eventually collapse.
Yes.
And so, that's not a good place to be. Right?
No, certainly not. And it's also, I think it's a significant percentage of the explanation as to why, so many young men in this country are now reluctant to join the armed forces, is because they look at what's being promoted by the mainstream media and what's being promoted by the Biden-Harris regime, this administration, and they go, why would I want to fight for something like that? Why would I want to, fight and die, potentially, and kill, for this cultural Marxist corporate woke garbage? It's not worth it. And so I don't blame them for feeling that way. When I was in the Navy, that's not what I joined up for. So I can certainly tell you that. And real quick, while you're here, I also wanted to ask, since we're on the transgender and gender dysphoria issue, you're running here in California. California is one of the ground zeros in this country for attempts by far left extremist Democrats and their corporate allies to gender transition children, and it's appalling and horrific. It's a monstrous atrocity. And so, what do you intend to do upon being elected to attempt to mitigate that and combat that and protect our kids? Yeah,
so let's set the background for this, right? So I come from the libertarian wing of the Republican Party,
yes.
Right? I'd never been to a Republican event or donated to a Republican candidate who wasn't named Ron Paul before I decided to run for office. So my general one of my general prime directives is always that your decisions over your own life, your own body,
right,
should be maximally made closest to you.
Yes.
Right. So you, your partner, your family, and if there have to be regulations at the city, local level, if there have to be you want less regulations at the state level, and you want minimal regulations at the federal level.
Yes.
Right. That's just a general incentive structure to go through. However, certain things the federal government has historically been involved in. One of the things that it's been involved in is regulation of human subject experimentation. And if you want to have a discussion about what's going on in the trans movement, trans community, there are rules for this, right? And we were talking about this a bit offline before we came on, but I'm not... it's not in my personality to be an activist, generally. I tend to be look at things hyperlogically, and I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. So the way I perceive what's going on in the trans community, in particular with regards to gender affirmation, and specifically with regards to pharmaceutical and surgical interventions, is that there's a theory that is being tested. And the theory in its most charitable sense is that people who identify as trans, if they elect to take a surgical or a chemical intervention, then you will see a reduction in suicidality over the course of their lifetime, and you'll see a reduction of metaphysical, psychological maladies like anxiety, depression, etc. That's a theory. Right?
Yes.
In order to test the theory, you have to run an experiment.
Yes.
In order to, this is just technical, non-political, in order to test the theory, you have to run an experiment.
Right.
If you run an experiment that involves human subjects, there are rules that apply because it's human subject experimentation. And following the atrocities of the World War II, we promulgated the Nuremberg Code, which sets minimum baseline ethical considerations that need to be taken in cases of if you want to ethically conduct human subject experimentation. So when I talk about this, sometimes people go like, but this isn't, we're not talking about experiments, we're talking about approved treatments. It's like, yes, but treatments are supposed to be approved based off of the results that come from experiments.
Right. And
in order to be able to make a claim about the reduction of suicidality, you have to be able to do experiments that are longitudinal over the course of a large enough cohort, say 1,000 people, 500 people, over the course of their lifetime. And then you'll be able to make a definitive conclusion as to a definitive answer to the question you sought out to answer about the reduction of suicidality over time. Otherwise, you can't say that.
Right.
You have to say you don't know. You have to say that there's a chance that it can go up. You have to say there's at least an equal chance that it can go up or it can go down.
Right.
Right. So the Nuremberg Code states that if there's going to be human subject experimentation, rule number one is informed consent. And informed consent has two parts. Part A is information.
Yep.
What information are you providing? This is everything we know about it. Here's what we think is going to be good. This is what we know is going to be the harmful cause for it. And then here's the unknown risks that may or may not be that we don't know, right? All of that information needs to be provided.
Yes.
Right? It's not being provided, but
Right.
It should be provided.
It's supposed to be, yep.
One of the other things that needs to be provided is you are participating in an experiment. We don't know. This could go disastrously wrong.
Yeah.
And you need to understand that before you go into this, right?
Yeah.
These are detransitioners. You need to understand their story to go into this. This is just your information as a patient that you're entitled to for your protection.
Yes.
Right? The second element of it, besides the information, is you have to have the capacity to consent.
Competency.
You have to have capacity to consent. Yeah. Right? We know now psychologically that people their developmental capacity does not peak until 25. Right?
Yes.
But historically, we have a need for people in the military, and we have a compromise range of somewhere in the 18-year-old that we arbitrarily determine to be age of majority. But the age of majority, even if it's arbitrarily drawn, means something. It means you lack the developmental capacity to make long-term decisions.
Yeah.
You lack the ability to say, look, when I'm 30 or when I'm 40 or I'm 50, here's one potential future I may have if I make this decision. Here's another potential future I may have if I don't make a different decision, and to compare those different futures against each other. Since you can't do that, you can't make any decisions. That's the system design. That's the way the system's properly designed. If you're below that age, conversely, you don't get to make any decisions.
Right.
Right? It doesn't mean your parents get to make the decisions for you. That's actually a misnomer. Parents cannot consent for you to engage in pornography.
No, absolutely not.
Right?
Nor should they, or take narcotic drugs.
They cannot consent for you to do things. What they do is they hold your consent power, right, which properly should be exercised by the child when they're no longer a child.
Right.
Like once the only person that should make decisions about your body permanently are you after you become an adult.
Yes.
Not you when you're 16, not you when you're 12, not your parents when you're 12 or 14.
No.
Your parents should just be
Certainly
saying,
not.
we're holding on to this power, protecting you from doing anything stupid with it.
It's a guardianship.
Until you're 18, exactly. Until we give it to you when you're 18. And then hopefully we trained you well enough to do it in a way that we find appropriate. But if not, you're an adult and it's America and you're entitled to make bad decisions.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the structure how it's supposed to be. Something perverse has happened over the past couple of decades, especially in California. In California, you see it bright and clear.
Yes.
If the politicians like the thing, they lower the age of consent.
Yes.
If the politicians do not like the thing, it's booze, tobacco,
Guns,
right? They raise it to 21.
Yes.
Why? Now they'll remember the reason why we have age majority: lack of developmental capacity. Lack of developmental capacity. That's what they'll say when you're raising it.
Yep.
But when they lower it, because it's something they do like, abortion, making your own trans decisions,
Right.
Then they lower the age of consent, right? Mind you, you still can't go to a tanning salon until you're 18.
That's right.
Because of the risk of danger and your lack of developmental capacity to understand. These are two, like either you believe in this idea of age of consent and that exists for a reason, age of majority. And if you do, then everything that happens once you become an adult becomes that person, it's vested, the decision-making is vested in there.
I don't think minors are even allowed to get tattoos, typically.
Absolutely not. No, this is it's because you lack the developmental capacity to be able to understand whether it's a good idea to tattoo a spider on your forehead.
Right. Yes.
That might when you're drunk with your friends, you might think that's a good idea, but you lack the developmental capacity to understand.
Right.
If you're 18 and you want to be like the guy in Venice Beach who tattooed his face like a lizard, who split his tongue like a lizard, who did plastic surgery on his eyes like a lizard, and makes a living being the lizard man, it's America.
Yeah.
The government shouldn't send the police to stop you from doing that.
Right.
Should we have to pay for it because it's healthcare?
Certainly not.
No, it's cosmetic surgery.
That's right.
Do we have to call him a lizard? Do we have to make accommodations to?
No.
How much of this delusion do we have to play into? Zero.
Yeah,
right?
to call him by his preferred lizard pronouns or whatever, lizard self.
We should not send the police the power of the state to make this person's life in any way inconvenient because of this. But that doesn't mean that we should have to participate in any way.
No.
Right?
Anyone who doesn't want to, yeah.
Yeah. So, but he's an adult.
Yeah.
The problem is when you have a child who lacks the capacity to consent.
Yeah.
Right? The only thing that can be done in that situation is to explain to the child this is a permanent, life-changing decision.
Yeah.
And the only person that can make that decision is you when you're 18.
Right.
And then historically, for most of my life and all of life before that, if a child came around and said, if you don't do the thing that I want, I'm going to hold my breath and I'm going to kill myself. Mm-hmm. It never has any psychologist ever said that what you should do in that situation is to give the child the thing that they want and that they're going to threaten to kill themselves if they don't get.
It would be the logical equivalent of humoring the delusions of a paranoid schizophrenic who's talking to a jug of milk. You know, if you were to humor his delusion by telling him that he's correct and that jug of milk is in fact sentient and is responding to him, that would actually be the cruel thing to do.
Yes.
You know, the right thing to do would be to explain to him that no, this is not correct. This is not part of objective reality, and you're participating in a potentially very dangerous and at minimum counterproductive fantasy.
Yes. Well, but this is what we were talking about earlier, right? About when it comes to, I'm not averse to the idea of conducting controversial human subject experimentation correctly. Mm-hmm. And so when I was in university, I served on an institutional review board for 7 years. Mm-hmm. And an institutional review board exists to ensure that Nuremberg Code is applied in any case of human subject experimentation. Mm-hmm. Right? And so for me, this is just normal practice.
Yeah.
So that's when this whole, people are like, gender affirmation treatment came around. It's like, okay, well, let me look up the research studies. Right? I mean, if it's approved, well, there's got to be a process for approval. Well, it turns out that the process for approval involved political decisions.
Yeah.
That simply said, you don't have to do the research for this.
Right.
And then, and that's when the Spidey sense starts going off.
Yeah.
Because these aren't optional.
No.
The Nuremberg Code is not optional.
Right. It's supposed to be settled law, yeah.
Well, and whether it's the law of the land that specifically applies or not is a complex question because there's powerful incentives that don't want the Nuremberg Code to be the law of the land. And we can get into that. Mm-hmm. But the morally and philosophically, coming from the atrocities of World War II, the Nuremberg Code is what prevents that. Mm. So whether the law says you don't have to comply with the Nuremberg Code or not, you're supposed to comply with the Nuremberg Code as a licensed medical professional.
As a matter of ethics, yeah.
The reason why professionals do not get government, like direct government regulation, and why they're instead regulated by peers who have moral and ethical charges is because they're supposed to understand the intricacies of their profession better. They're supposed to raise the bar of ethics higher than that could have been created by the government alone. What a doctor should have a better understanding of why the Nuremberg Code is necessary to prevent the practice of medicine from getting off the rails more than a government bureaucrat.
Right.
But the job of the American Medical Association and the job of the American Psychological Association is to enforce on their members the Nuremberg Code and to prevent them from engaging in unethical human subject experimentation. That's really their core mission. And similar to what the example we've given with regards to the military, if that's your core mission, but you're not doing your core mission because you're doing anything else, now you got an issue.
Yeah.
And the issue is your core mission will not happen. And what happened was they had a political directive. And the political directive was you have to be as open and inclusive as possible. And you had this evolution because it was as recent as 2000, not long ago, that in Texas, sodomy was still illegal. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It was perfectly justifiable for the state to send in use their monopoly power to enter the bedroom of an individual who was engaging in conduct that they didn't like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
the backlash to that and the Supreme Court correction for that case,
Lawrence versus Texas,
was leave them alone. They're adults.
Yeah.
What business does the federal government have regulating the lives of adults?
Right.
Right? Why are we using the police power for this? It was 70%, 80% of the country could get behind that. It's like, look, you guys are adults.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. We don't care. Like, this is not something that should be the police power.
I just don't want to see it, don't want to hear about it, you know?
And then but that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Right? And then it turned into appreciation days.
Right.
And then it turned into infusion of ideology into the school system, right? And then at a certain point, when the bell goes off, why aren't you doing math until the bell comes back on?
Yeah.
Why is there 15 minutes of therapy communication? Like when I was a kid, I didn't know my teacher's first name. I didn't know if they were gay or straight. I might have guessed if they were married, if they had a wedding ring on.
Yeah, sure.
But I wouldn't know what they did over the weekends.
No.
God knows I wouldn't know what what type of genitalia they had, how they felt about it, what they did with it on the weekend.
Right.
And God forbid that, or God help them if they ever tried to ask us that.
Right.
Because our parents wouldn't have tolerated it.
It's completely inappropriate.
And that's where it's like, where did this get infused into the school system at all? Right? Because it's like, look, it's a question of degree. It's like even social conservatives will agree that the police shouldn't go into the gay couple's home.
Right.
But there's boundaries, right? And when I'm talking to more conservative people, I like to say like on 3 different prongs. I have a similar philosophy on religious freedom, on what happens in your bedroom, and what happens with your doctor. I think that the general presumption in all 3 of those things is government should get out.
Yes.
The government, generally speaking, should get out of all 3. That's the presumption.
The baseline presumption.
The baseline presumption.
Yep.
But again, it's
default setting,
right? But defaults can always be overcome, right?
Yes.
This is the thing.
Manual override.
Necessary corrective action, right? And so take religious freedom, right? Okay? Because a lot of people want to say that religious freedom can be absolute too, right? What about child sacrifice?
Right, yeah. No.
Right? Child sacrifice. That's
not allowed.
Child sacrifice is out, right? What about female genital mutilation?
No. Or honor killings.
Yeah, right? Male genital mutilation, things get a little bit trickier. Culturally, we're more accepting of it because it's been a practice that's been around for a long period of time, and the damage is not remotely comparable to female genital mutilation.
Correct.
Right?
It does not impair functionality, and also there are certain we can argue about whether it's more beneficial or more harmful in totality in a net sense, but there are certain medical benefits to circumcision. That mainly hygienic.
Yes, but that is not. But not necessarily. What I'm getting at is it's a religious decision. It's not a medical. It's not
for some.
It's not. I mean, for some, it's a medical necessity.
Right.
But for most, it's not a medical necessity.
Like my parent, when I was born, my parents had it done to me for strictly medical reasons. We're not Jewish at all, but they just said, it seems like a good idea because it's good for sanitation.
Yes. But you want to. I'm saying I give that. I strike that as a point because there's the stuff that's clearly off limits. Right. There's the stuff we can have a discussion about.
Yeah.
But we always want to have the discussion in the context of if it's a non-necessary medical procedure, what are the ethical steps that we should take in analyzing this before we permit it to go forward, right? Because an institutional review board's charged with enforcing these ethical guidelines, right? Which means don't automatically approve. Go and do an analysis. Like, what considerations are you taking to ensure mitigating long-term harm?
Of course.
And in that context, the circumcision has maximum level of protection and thought into preventing alternative outcomes. Right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, that's the religious context, right? Generally, get out. I mean, government should stay out, but under certain circumstances, it's conceivable that even under that situation, the default can be overcome, right?
Yes.
In your bedroom, right? Again, are you adults? Yes. Government, get out, right?
Yes.
But can the government check to make sure everybody's adults?
Yes. Yes.
Hey,
there's reasonable things that can be done.
If they have probable cause to believe that you're in there with a 12-year-old,
right?
That's when people now all of a sudden
they can kick the door down. Yeah.
the change of opinion, right? Now you can do that, right?
Yep.
Doctor-patient relationship, right? Similarly, default. The government should be out of it. However, can a doctor trade opiates to one of their addict clients in exchange for sexual favors?
Right. That would be a very severe violation, not only of all applicable laws, but the ethics of their profession.
But what I'm saying is that just because it's the doctor-patient relationship doesn't mean that there's no role for regulation. That's the whole, on all three of these domains.
And
right?
same even goes for attorney-client privilege.
That's what I just use. I use these because like the bedroom and the bedroom example tends to land more with people who are temperamentally left-leaning, right?
Yeah.
Because they want to be left alone when it comes to the bedroom and the medical decisions.
Yes.
And the religious people tend to want absolute being left alone from the religious side. And
Yes.
if all three of those groups could understand their commonality in wanting the government to leave them alone, but also understanding that in all three of those groups, there have to be outer guardrails.
Yes.
Because all three of those can be abused. And when the abuse happens in there, it tends to be quite severe because each one of them is in a position of control over a vulnerable population by definition, except for the bedroom.
That's where lots of violations of rights tend to occur. And speaking of excessive regulation, I wanted to pivot slightly. This is related, but it's a little bit of a pivot to the recent Supreme Court decision that really it was a legal earthquake that overturned the traditional Chevron deference, which I think had been in place for about 40 years, since the early to mid 80s. You're an attorney, obviously, and just a disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This is just our commentary and punditry. But what is your view of the precedent that the overturning of the Chevron deference will set for those attempting to challenge particularly federal regulators, but also in some cases state bureaucrats get down the line? Like, for example, when the EPA wants to classify the puddle on your property as a protected wetland, what do you think how do you think people can use this recent Supreme Court ruling to protect themselves against, overweening bureaucrats and regulators?
Yeah. So, how much an individual can use it is going to. I don't necessarily think it's the most helpful way to look at it because Supreme Court jurisprudence evolves over time. They're less focused on how an individual is going to be able to use this in the case. They're focused on. For example, what's the relationship between the executive and the legislature going to be in a power-sharing relationship 10 years from now? And that level is much more interesting and important than really what's happening at the individual level with regards to Chevron, right? So what happened in Chevron? So in Chevron, the people mistakenly distort they abuse this discussion a lot, and they're focusing on something that's not quite accurate, right? So when a government agency issues a decision, right, or issues a regulation, right, that regulation can be, we have direct authorization by statute to issue this regulation, right? Clear. The organization is able to issue regulations even post Chevron when it comes to that. The question is if there's ambiguity left in the statute, right? The ambiguity can be of different types. The ambiguity can be, what should it have been, 100 parts per million or 1,000 parts per million? Okay, and if that's the case, who would be better to decide that ambiguity? An expert at the EPA or a federal judge? Right?
Okay, yeah.
Then there's a second category, right, which is if the ambiguity is about the scope of the power that the regulators have. Like, does their action fall underneath the umbrella of does the regulation fall? Was the regulation issued because the law granted the agency the authority to do that? In Chevron, they said it was ambiguous to whether the agency had the authority to issue the regulation at all, but that ambiguity, when there's a federal agency involved, is going to be the Chevron deference.
Yes.
As long as it's reasonable, the interpretation is reasonable, we will defer to them. Right? And what that does is it takes a little bit of power that is properly given to the legislature and stealing it and putting it into the executive.
Right.
And it takes some power from the judiciary which is supposed to be the one that's handling this dispute, and gives it to the executive.
Yeah.
So since Chevron, we have seen an aggrandizement of power at the in the executive branch, right? And the current Supreme Court is in the process of paring that down. Is in the process of restoring the power to the different branches in what some people would consider a proper orientation,
Yes.
according to like the founding fathers. Right?
Absolutely.
So what you should see happen after Chevron is a lot more regulations get struck down because they were based off of this interpretive method that no longer exists.
Well, kind of like how shortly thereafter, I believe the Supreme Court, using kind of similar reasoning, they struck down the federal executive ban on bump stocks.
For very similar reasons.
Yeah, as well, because the ATF took it upon itself to, under Trump, I think Trump was originally, unfortunately, the one that authorized this, but they took it upon themselves to define tools such as bump stocks as machine guns within the definition of the National Firearms Act.
Yes.
Which is a very dubious classification. Of course, for ATF bureaucrats to be, taking it upon themselves to make.
Well, and I mean, and this is the guardrails that the Supreme Court started to enforce, which is they're saying that if you want, and it came up with the major questions doctrine, which is related as well, right? Is that if it is something that affects a significant portion of the economy, involves significant equities, then Congress is expected to speak clearly when they make that, when they pass that law. They're not going to say, here's the code section. You have section A, B, C, D. D's the catch-all, and then it's got 10 different words in there, and then there's an other. And because it has other in there, we've included this $1.3 trillion regulation of the economy. Right?
Well, because that would be presumptively void for vagueness, right? If it wasn't specific enough in what it purports to regulate or ban.
Yes, the document. There's the common law concepts like vagueness and rule of lenity, which people have forgotten about, right? And so, again, I practice criminal law. So, what happens when you have an ambiguity in the laws that apply to a criminal, right? The rule of lenity states that if it's criminal law, somebody could be imprisoned, lose their life. If the law is ambiguous, the benefit goes to the defendant. Right?
Yes.
In our system, typically, the benefit goes to the defendant. So if the law is deficient, the benefit goes to the defendant. The government just can't can't just reinterpret the law to include a behavior that they want it to include. But the defendant wouldn't have any reason to realize or know that the law would otherwise apply to them.
Err on the side of the person who's in jeopardy of losing their liberty or property or life in some cases.
Exactly.
So err on that side.
But this also, and you saw this play out in one of the Supreme Court cases about the J6ers.
Fisher versus United States, right?
So yeah, because you had the case with the J6ers, where you had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that had within it a catch-all section that said don't disturb
disrupting official proceedings.
Official proceedings, right? Yep. And that was in the subsection that applied to
I think it was Enron, right?
Destruction, yeah. Sarbanes-Oxley. It was the reforms that passed after Enron, and it was related to because they were all destroying documents.
Yeah.
So and then they were all pointing finger at each other, saying, "I didn't know you. I didn't know you were destroying documents. Oh, it was him that was destroying documents. Oh, who had any idea who was destroying documents?"
Trying to pass that ball.
They gave an affirmative obligation for a handful of people to all be aware of all the documents, right? And then if there was a proceeding going on involved in those, it makes perfect context in the way that it was decided, right? But then there was J6 that happened, and there was a political incentive to reinterpret that to include this new. It didn't seem very. This novel. Didn't really seem that novel.
By overzealous federal prosecutors.
Yeah, exactly. So that you just had the federal prosecutors who'd made a political decision that they wanted to imprison as many of the people who are on the Capitol day as possible. So then they started reinterpreting the rules and the laws that existed to be able to affect their political goal of maximum imprisonment. Yep.
And ruining these people's lives.
Well, but that's a consequence, right? I'm just trying to objectively describe what I saw happening, right?
Yeah.
I'm a Like, I'm a temperamentally lefty criminal defense lawyer. Like, I work at a domestic violence shelter.
Right.
Like, I met my wife at Burning Man. Like, it's
excellent.
It's like, but I also love our country.
Right.
And our Constitution's pretty amazing.
Yes, it is.
It's written by some pretty amazing people.
As constitutions go, it certainly is.
It's elegant in the way that it balances these different powers and functions, and you can't just mess with that. You can't just distort that. And then all of a sudden, I mean, you saw this happen with J6. It's like anytime a prosecutor gets up there and it's like, I'm out for blood. I want maximum imprisonment. I want maximum incarceration. This shouldn't sit right with people.
No, and it certainly doesn't sit right with us here at CA Propertcast or at Red Angeles. That's for damn sure. But Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for shedding light, especially on what motivated you to run against Mr. Gil Cisneros. Our best wishes and Godspeed for that, because he certainly is a tyrant in his temperament and in his ideology. So we really hope that you put a stop to him.
And I'll say one final thing.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course.
So he was in the House for one term, right? Because he won the seat in Orange County and then lost it after he had some accusations of sexual misconduct popped up.
Okay.
So
interesting.
So I completely blanked there at the end.
No, it's quite all right. But I don't know of the nature of those accusations, but they certainly are serious.
Yeah.
That's true. And thank you so much also for, as an attorney, aside from your candidacy, shedding light on potential implications of the jurisprudence that recently overturned the Chevron deference. It's another legal and political and maybe even a cultural earthquake in this country, right up there with the Bruin decision, expanding protection for gun rights, and right up there with the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. Certainly there's never a dull moment in the legal world, and I'm certain that as an attorney you're very in tune to that. And thank you for shedding light on it for most of our viewers who are not attorneys. Myself included. And we hope to have you on again sometime reasonably soon. Yeah. And again, Godspeed with your candidacy, and God bless and stay free. And as always, everyone out there who ends up watching this, semper tyrannis.
Yeah.